The name of this podcast is Echoes of the Hypernatural. And that, before I explain what that means, I have to sort of start from the other end of the spectrum. So, you start with Pokemon Go, and then you go to the GPS map, and then you go to the paper map, and then you go to the linguistic map that describes the paper map, and then you go to Einstein's, what's really not Einstein's not the person that came up with the geometrical, or he didn't favor the geometrical interpretation of his theory. He just thought of it as pure mathematics. It was these other physicists. One of them is Weil. So I call it the Einstein-Weil space-time hypernatural. And by hypernatural, I mean that it's the natural that's already reproduced, sort of in the same sense that Jean Baudrillard used to talk about the real being hyper-real because it was the real that was already reproduced and people just couldn't tell. So I'm using that idea, but for a different purpose. And so the Einstein-Weil space-time hypernatural is like a map that we place over nature, and then we forget that it's a map, and that creates all the problems. So, and then after that conceals the naturally organized divisions of, and that leads to the explanation of the naturally organized divisions, which is where Echoes of the Hypernatural comes in. And the explanations for the naturally organized divisions are actually referred to by the Einstein-Weil space-time hypernatural. I'm saying that their theories aren't to be taken literally. You can reinterpret them as metaphors for these explanations that I'm talking about. I actually call them general and special rotations of the self-rotating Dow-Wars hypermetric. And the Dow-Wars part has to do with the fact that there's 4 versions of the Tao and 4 versions of everything. So when you hear that expression, the Tao that is told is not the eternal Tao, that fits in with this. So the hypermetric is really, when I say general and special, you probably think general and special theory of relativity. Well, that's because that's a metaphor for Einstein's equations in general and special relativity, where he talks about the metric tensor. So he never really liked the geometrical interpretation of his equations. He always thought the metric tensor was as if there was like this hidden mathematical realm that existed somewhere. So that's one thing that all these thinkers throughout history have had in common, is where they're always appealing to something hidden that exists, whether it's a hidden bang or a hidden being. It's still intended as something that exists. So it always leaves the question, what is existence in the first place? Because even if you had like a hidden being and then you had like the universe, you still have to explain both of them and their relationship and like how they interact with each other, and it creates all the same problems that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm saying that the theories of physics, like the Big Bang theory, superstring theory, Einstein's special and general theory of relativity, they all are metaphors for what I'm going to be talking about. So it changes they're no longer to be judged against reality, if that makes any sense. They're not there for that purpose. And what else? And so there's going to have to be, this is not just for science, but politics as well. There's going to have to be a breaking of one's ideal. The actual 8th chapter, and the chapters correspond to levels of illumination. And the 8th chapter, they all are Star Wars like titles. So the 8th one is Fall of the Righteous Idealists, and that one example of that is true authenticity does not mean pure authenticity, or true collectivism does not mean pure collectivism. So in that case, the collectivists, there's like extreme collectivism where they want to eliminate capitalism altogether. They don't want any competition. It's almost like a utopia where everyone just sits around and meditates or something, kind of like in the movies. And then there's the other extreme, which almost wants anarchy, voluntarism, or anarcho-capitalism. And the problem is both sides are always, they both think that they have the true ideal, or the true priorities, and that the other priorities need to be bent, of course. And so that leads to problems in society, when you could build a system where both priorities are taken into account, where they don't interfere with each other, such as, I talk about this in this chapter too. The first level of change is going to occur in the world is a hemp plastic subsidy. And what that means is, say Alaska has an oil subsidy, so each resident of Alaska gets like a certain amount of money per month, and that is like a subsidy. So you could do the same thing with the rest of the states, and you can have the federal government grow hemp and then make hemp plastic and then sell it in the open market, the free market. So other people could do this. No one would be prohibited from making hemp plastic. But the government would sell it to the companies and replace all the plastic bottles, for example. And people would buy those products, and that would fund a subsidy or basic income. And the Congress, their new role could be switched over to almost arguing over which state deserves more. I mean, you could do it by population minus population density and plus or minus other factors, but ultimately the cost of living for each state. But ultimately the congressman would become lobbyists for state their share of the subsidy, not working for corporations. So instead of like trying to challenge the desire to accumulate symbolic power over others, that's what government really is, you harness it instead. You give them something better to do. Because even if you like could get rid of government, like in Iraq, it just creates chaos until the niche is filled again. That should be a clue that anarchism could never, it's not that it's a failed theory, it's that it could never even initiate. The closest thing to anarchism is sort of the Wild Wild West, and even if you achieve something like that, you would have to, the banks, that kind of mentality would still swoop in over time. So there's this guy Daniel pointed out to me, there's these old Jedi tales that George Lucas used to work on, and it talks about the Jedi kicking out sort of the Jedi that broke the rules, and that's sort of like Trump throwing out the Muslims because they're causing problems. And in the Star Wars universe, that created the Sith. Those sort of like exiled Jedis became the Sith. So you can always try to get rid of the problem by sweeping it under the rug and getting rid of it, or that'll create a bigger problem if you do that. At least in the Star Wars universe. But you could see it with, if Trump kicks out Muslims, then you create probably more attacks on the United States. Whereas Spain, they had Muslim terror attacks like 5 years ago, based on the fact that Muslims couldn't come into the country for some reason or something like that, and the president just lifted that ban, and that's ends all the problems. So back to the hemp subsidy. So the hemp subsidy is actually also, so the individualists, they get basically something that replaces welfare and taxes in exchange for this. They don't have, there's no more like corrections needed to the, you don't have to interfere with the market itself to get something that's a buffer to the market. That's, I guess that's what I'm getting at. And so you won't get resistance from individualists, and it's good for the environment because the hemp plastic is biodegradable and CO2 neutral. And yes, the other thing is that most poverty is structural, and especially for black people, like they were born into poverty, and it's based on pre-existing conditions from racism a long time ago. So, and then that leads to second order racism, that leads to crime, which leads to second order racism from the cops, which you can't really blame them for being racist. They're just reacting to what they see every day. But even if that what they see every day is because of white people a long time ago, you see. So what you do is you have to fix the poverty problem to diminish the crime problem, which diminishes the cop racism problem. And yeah, you can solve a lot of problems that way. But just making it so everyone can afford to live. I don't mean everyone can afford to live with 5 houses, but you also don't want to take away that, because there's some people want to have 5 houses, and they're going to resist you if you try to take that freedom away from them. So if you want the solution that's the path of least resistance, which is, well, that's the path that's ultimately going to happen. I think that's the prediction. I'm not really starting a movement. I'm making a prediction that this is based on something that Robert Anton Wilson, the science fiction writer, said. He said that national boundaries are sort of what is just the end result of two sides that were tired of fighting. So they just kind of they got tired of fighting, and so they signed a treaty. And that's sort of what all this idealism, I think, was going to happen to it. That eventually we're going to stop fighting, and the memes aren't going to be enough to satisfy us. We'll exhaust all the ways that we can make fun of each other. And we'll start to take the other ideals into account. Like this hemp subsidy thing, that could solve so many problems all at once. And it's right there. So I'm actually watching the sunset right now. Yep. So there's these 9 chapters to this book. It's called Special Rotations of the Self-Rotating Tao Wars Hypermetric. And then there's this diagram that I built, which is called General Rotations of what I just said. And the Special Rotations one has all the Star Wars chapters and Star Wars-like chapters, and they are meant to elaborate on the diagram part. And I have a couple friends trying to help me with building a fictional story around it that might be interesting, that's interactive, where the person reading it would become a character that would have to make decisions, and those decisions influence whether you can jump to the next chapter or the next level of illumination. Some of the chapters are like the first one, The Phantom Simulacrum. That's mostly talking about the screen. How the screen hyper imaginary conceals that the linguistic map is there. So the screen map conceals the linguistic map, makes us not pay attention to it, and take it more seriously. We don't question the boundary of where the linguistic map ends and nature begins, and especially with the Einstein-Wiles space-time hypernatural. That right there is a map that gets confused with nature or the naturally organized divisions. And some of those divisions are like abdomen, thorax, head. Like I have you can see it in a bee or a beetle. It's a lot easier to see. It gets disguised in other animals. And some animals don't have any of those divisions. Or plant, like trees, don't have any of those divisions. But they do have the next scale down, which is organ system, organ, tissue. Then you go down a scale and you have the cell, which is outer cell, nucleus, and nucleolus, which is like a supermolecule that manufactures the ribosomal enzymes, which are like 40 proteins, by the way. That's the next level down. We have the modified tertiary protein. That's like after the protein gets folded. We'll get to that in a second. So there's the modified tertiary protein, and then the quaternary structure, and then that's within a system of quaternary structures that are functional. If any part of this structural completion of these quaternary structures was any different, then there would be nothing functional about the cell. But anyway, so the next scale down is primary, secondary, and tertiary folds. You see how these scales are connected? So primary, secondary, and tertiary folding into a protein, and then the next scale up, the tertiary protein gets modified, and then it gets built into a quaternary structure, and then there's multiple quaternary structures within a cell. Okay, so next scale down from the primary, secondary, and tertiary structure is the exon, gene, and promoter sections, or sites. I think that's what they call them. You can see that all these scales are coming in threes, or it's really 2 and 1, and then it's not just 2 and 1, it's 1 and 2, and they're both true but in different ways. So you could see that the 6 scales that I just talked about are actually grouped into 4 and 2, or 6. And that's because those pairs of scales, like abdomen, thorax, head, and organ system, organ, tissue, those pairs of scales, each with 3 parts, are actually a part of what I call a hyperscale, which also has 3 parts. And those hyperscales come in pairs, which are parts of superscales. So it's not simply that there's hierarchical scales to nature, or that there's even one scale, like how physicists think. It's that there's multiple scales, and there's multiple coordinate systems, which also have parts, and they're also scales, like radial, theta, and phi orientations for the Earth, where the theta is the angle that goes with the spin, and